In 1966, a Texas entrepreneur named Rollin King sketched a triangle on a cocktail napkin and handed it to his lawyer, Herb Kelleher. The triangle connected 3 Texas cities, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. King's idea was to start an airline that flew only between those 3 cities, at prices low enough that people who would normally drive or take a bus would choose to fly instead. Kelleher was skeptical. He became convinced. Together they founded what would become Southwest Airlines. The incumbent airlines, Braniff International, Texas International Airlines, and Continental, immediately tried to prevent Southwest from operating. The legal battle to obtain operating authority lasted nearly 4 years, cost Southwest most of its initial capitalization, and ended with Herb Kelleher personally arguing the case before the Texas Supreme Court. Southwest won. It launched in 1971. At the time of launch, every element of Southwest's business model would have failed the standard evaluation of an airline investment. It operated only secondarily airports, not primary hubs. It served no food. It had no seat assignments, no interlining with other carriers, no frequent flyer program, no first-class cabin, and no reservation system compatible with the major global distribution platforms that travel agents used. Its aircraft turned around at the gate in less than 20 minutes, faster than any major carrier, and faster than many thought possible. It operated only one aircraft type, the Boeing 737, which eliminated the training and maintenance complexity of a mixed fleet. Each of these choices was the result of a single organizing principle that most airline executives of the 1970s would have considered commercially suicidal: absolute, uncompromising cost minimization in service of the lowest possible price. The airline industry in 1971 was regulated. The Civil Aeronautics Board set fares on interstate routes, which meant that price competition between airlines on regulated routes was illegal. Major carriers competed on service, meals, seat width, departure frequency, because they could not compete on price. This created a market structure in which the established players had no incentive to develop the cost discipline that Southwest was building, because cost discipline had no competitive value in a price-regulated environment. Southwest operated only within Texas, an intrastate carrier, not subject to federal route regulation. It could set its own prices. And its entire organizational architecture was built around the proposition that if you make flying cheap enough, you create a market that doesn't currently exist, the person who would not otherwise fly. The proposition sounds obvious in 2026. In 1971, it was genuinely radical, not because the logic was hard to understand, but because the entire infrastructure of the airline industry had been built around a different customer. The major carriers' hub and spoke networks, their reservation systems, their interlining agreements, their food service operations, their first-class cabins. All of it was built for the business traveler and the leisure traveler who had already decided to fly. Southwest was built for the person who had decided not to. When federal deregulation arrived in 1978, Southwest's model became applicable across the country, and the major carriers discovered that they could not replicate it. Not because the model was secret, but because replicating it would have required dismantling the infrastructure they had built around their existing customers in order to serve a different customer at a lower cost. The very capabilities that had made them successful in the regulated environment were the things that made Southwest's model inaccessible to them. Have you ever watched a competitor build something you understood completely but couldn't replicate because replicating it would have required giving up what you had? Leave a comment. The specific elements of Southwest's model that the majors found impossible to replicate form one of the most instructive lists in business strategy: the aircraft turnaround time. Southwest's sub-20-minute turn was the product of a culture of ground crews, pilots, and flight attendants who understood that every minute an aircraft sat at a gate was a minute it wasn't generating revenue, and of a contract structure with its unions that made the rapid turnaround economically rational for the employees executing it. A major carrier that wanted to match Southwest's turn time would have had to renegotiate union contracts that had been built around a different operational rhythm. The renegotiation cost, both financial and relational, was larger than the competitive benefit in any near-term calculation. The single aircraft type. Southwest's 737-only fleet eliminated the training and maintenance complexity that came with mixed fleets. A major carrier converting to a single aircraft type would have had to retire aircraft that were still economically operational and retrain maintenance staff and pilots who had been trained on multiple types. The transition cost, again, exceeded the competitive benefit in any planning horizon the major carriers used. The no-meal, no-frills service model. Southwest's service model was not simply cheaper than the majors. It was built on a different proposition about what flying was for. The majors had told their customers for decades that flying was a premium experience. Dismantling the service model would have required telling those same customers that the premium experience was being eliminated. Southwest never had to have that conversation because Southwest never made the promise. If the specific mechanism of why competitors can understand a strategy completely and still be unable to adopt it, because adoption would require dismantling the thing adoption is supposed to improve, is the level of analysis you come here for. The like is the direct signal. Southwest's employees during the company's founding period were not working for an organization with conventional job security. The legal battles nearly bankrupted the company before it launched. The competitive pressure from established carriers created genuine uncertainty about whether the model would be allowed to operate. The employees who chose Southwest in the early 1970s were making a bet on a model, on a leadership team, and on a proposition about the market that was genuinely unproven. The culture that Southwest built during that period, which has been studied extensively and which became one of the most cited examples of culture as competitive advantage in organizational literature, was not the product of a deliberate culture-building program. It was the product of a specific set of conditions. A company that needed its employees to do more than their job description said, at a pace that exceeded industry norms, for compensation that was competitive but not exceptional, in a business where the survival of the company was genuinely uncertain. The Southwest employees who worked the 30-minute turns, who handled gate duties that would have been performed by separate staff at major carriers, who understood intuitively that the cost structure was the strategy, those employees were not responding to a culture initiative. They were responding to a situation that made the relationship between their effort and the company's survival visible and immediate in a way that most large organizations never create. The people who flew Southwest in the early years were, for many of them, people who had not previously flown. The proposition that air travel could be the same price as a bus ticket was, to those customers, a genuine expansion of what was possible for them. The egalitarian seating, the lack of a first-class cabin, the lack of assigned seats, these were not service failures. They were the specific design of a product for customers who were not being served by the existing market. What Southwest won without a strategy anyone would have endorsed is not a generic lesson about ignoring conventional wisdom or betting on unconventional approaches. Those are the simplified versions. The specific lesson is more structural. Southwest won because it built its model for a customer that the existing competitors were not serving and had no incentive to serve, using capabilities that the existing competitors could not replicate because replication required dismantling the infrastructure they had built for the customers they were serving. This is the specific structure of a strategy that is genuinely difficult to compete with, not the one that does what the incumbents do, but better. The one that serves a customer the incumbents have no incentive to serve, in a way that requires capabilities the incumbents can't build without giving up what they already have. The practical question for any market: who is not being served by the current offerings? Not underserved, not served. And would serving them require the kind of organizational architecture that an incumbent couldn't adopt without dismantling the architecture it has built for its existing customers? If the answer to both questions is yes, the market for the strategy that Southwest invented is still available. The next episode looks at a case where that market was identified, that architecture was built, and the variable that nobody had quantified, the one that turned out to be the most important, arrived after the architecture was already in place. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.